At 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26, 1944, First Lieutenant John Fox crouched at a second-floor window in Colonia, Italy, as German infantry swarmed the streets below. Fox was 29 years old. He'd served as a forward observer with the 598th Field Artillery Battalion for 3 months. Most observers in Italy didn't last 2 weeks. The German attack had begun 4 hours earlier, with 300 infantry supported by tanks. American forces had already retreated from the village. Fox and 8 Italian partisans remained. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, was the only African-American infantry division fighting in Europe. Segregation meant Fox and his men trained separately, fought separately, and were often given the most dangerous assignments. Forward observers like Fox lived on the front lines with infantry units, calling artillery strikes on enemy positions. The job required perfect math under fire. One wrong coordinate could kill your own men. The average life expectancy for an artillery observer in the Italian campaign was measured in days, not weeks. Fox knew the statistics. He'd volunteered anyway. Christmas Day had been quiet in Colonia. The village sat in the Serchio River Valley, a strategic position the Americans had held for weeks. Fox's unit occupied defensive positions with the 366th Infantry Regiment. The men celebrated Christmas with what rations they had. Some wrote letters home. Fox had a wife, Arlene, and a 2-year-old daughter, Sandra, waiting in Massachusetts. He'd been away from them for over a year. At 4 o'clock that morning, everything changed. German artillery opened fire on American positions. Within minutes, uniformed German troops attacked from 2 directions. The assault was massive, well-coordinated, well-armed. American infantry companies fell back under heavy fire. The Germans had infiltrated during the night wearing civilian clothes. By dawn, they controlled half the village. Fox received orders to withdraw with the rest of the American forces. He made a different choice. Someone needed to stay and direct artillery fire, or the retreating Americans would be slaughtered. Fox ordered his observation party to leave. They refused. 8 Italian partisan fighters stayed with him. What happened next would determine whether hundreds of Americans escaped alive. Please hit the like button. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And subscribe. Back to Fox. From his second-floor position, Fox had a clear view of the German advance. He radioed fire coordinates to the 598th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned miles behind the American lines. His first fire mission landed perfectly, scattering a German infantry company forming for assault. He called for another barrage, then another. Each time, the shells landed closer to his own position. The Germans weren't stopping. They were adapting, using buildings for cover, advancing in small groups. Fox kept calling fire missions. His radio operator transmitted coordinates, while German voices shouted in the street below. By mid-morning, the Germans had surrounded Fox's building. Machine gun fire raked the second floor. Mortar rounds impacted nearby. Fox knew what was coming. The Germans would storm the building within minutes. He had one option left, one that would save the retreating Americans, but guarantee his own death. His battalion commander's voice crackled over the radio. Fox gave new coordinates. The commander protested. Those coordinates would bring artillery fire directly on Fox's position. Fox repeated the coordinates. The commander asked him to confirm. Fox's reply would echo through military history. But first, he had to decide if he was willing to die for men who wouldn't even share a mess hall with him back home. Fox understood what the segregated army meant. He'd grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where opportunities for Black Americans were limited. He attended Wilberforce University, one of the few colleges that allowed African Americans in ROTC programs. He graduated with an engineering degree in 1941. The Army commissioned him as a second lieutenant. Then they sent him to a segregated unit. The 92nd Division trained at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, isolated from white troops. They weren't allowed to eat with white soldiers, couldn't use the same facilities. When they shipped to Italy in September 1944, nothing changed. They fought and died for a country that wouldn't treat them as equals. Fox knew the men retreating from Samokolonia wouldn't have chosen to serve with him. The army made that choice. But they were still Americans. They had families waiting at home just like he did. The Germans advancing on his position didn't care about race. They'd kill anyone in American uniform. Fox made his decision. He told his battalion commander the coordinates one final time. The commander's voice came back over the radio. "Fox, that will be on you." Fox's reply was 8 words. "Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell." The 598th Field Artillery Battalion fired the mission. Multiple 155mm and 105mm howitzers opened fire simultaneously. The shells screamed overhead. Fox and the 8 Italian partisans with him died in the first salvo. So did approximately 100 German soldiers. The artillery barrage lasted several minutes. When it ended, the German advance had stopped. The delay gave retreating American forces time to regroup and establish new defensive positions. Without Fox's sacrifice, the Germans might have overrun them. American forces retook Samokolonia a week later, on January 1st, 1945. They found Fox's body on the second floor of the building where he'd made his last stand. Around him lay the bodies of German soldiers killed by the artillery he'd called on himself. The 8 Italian partisans had died alongside him. His radio was still clutched in his hand. The final coordinates he'd transmitted were written on a map beside him. The army buried Fox in Colebrook Cemetery in Whitman, Massachusetts. His widow Arlene received notification of his death. His 2-year-old daughter, Sandra, would grow up without her father. But the army didn't recommend Fox for any medal. His commander, Brigadier General William Colburn, endorsed him for the Distinguished Service Cross in early 1945. The recommendation went to Division Command. Then it disappeared. No explanation, no follow-up. The paperwork simply vanished. For decades, Fox's sacrifice remained largely unknown. The 92nd Division continued fighting in Italy until the war ended in May 1945. They fought at the Gothic Line, the Serchio Valley, and the final Allied offensive in northern Italy. The division suffered significant casualties. Many men performed acts of heroism. Few received recognition. The segregated army had a pattern. Black soldiers rarely received medals proportional to their service. Fox's story might have stayed buried forever. But in the early 1980s, someone started asking questions. Why had no African-American soldiers received the Medal of Honor in World War II? Not one, out of more than 1 million Black Americans who served. The investigation into that question would eventually lead back to a second-floor window in Samokolonia, and 8 words transmitted over a radio on December 26, 1944. The question of missing medals began with a simple observation. Military historians noticed a statistical impossibility. Over 1 million African Americans served in World War II. They fought in every theater: Europe, Pacific, North Africa. They died in the same battles as white soldiers, but when the war ended, not a single black soldier had received the Medal of Honor. The Army had awarded 433 Medals of Honor to soldiers in World War II. All of them went to white men. The pattern was clear. Either black soldiers never performed acts worthy of the nation's highest award, or something else was happening. In 1993, the Army commissioned Shaw University in North Carolina to investigate. Researchers examined thousands of military records. They looked for African American soldiers who'd been recommended for high awards, but received lesser medals instead. They found recommendations that had been downgraded. Distinguished Service Cross recommendations changed to Silver Stars. Silver Star recommendations changed to Bronze Stars. The pattern repeated across units and theaters. Race appeared to be the determining factor. The researchers found something else. They found recommendations that had simply disappeared. No explanation in the files, no record of denial. The paperwork had been filed and then vanished. Fox's Distinguished Service Cross recommendation was one of them. His commander had submitted it in early 1945. Division Command had received it. Then, nothing. For 37 years, the recommendation sat lost in Army files. In 1982, someone finally found it. The Army awarded Fox the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously. Arlene Fox received the medal at a ceremony. It was better than nothing. but it wasn't what her husband had earned. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest military decoration. It recognizes extraordinary heroism in combat. Fox had called artillery on his own position, knowing it would kill him, to save retreating American forces. That action exceeded the standard for extraordinary heroism. It met the standard for conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, the exact wording for the Medal of Honor. But in 1982, the Army stopped at the DSC. The researchers at Shaw University wanted to know why. They examined Fox's case alongside others. They found a pattern. When white soldiers called artillery or airstrikes on their own positions, they often received the Medal of Honor. When black soldiers performed similar actions, they received lesser awards, if they received anything at all. The evidence suggested systematic discrimination in the awards process. The researchers compiled their findings. They identified 7 African American soldiers from World War II whose actions clearly warranted the Medal of Honor. Fox was among them. In 1996, they submitted their report to Congress. Congress faced a decision. The Medal of Honor has a strict time limit. Recommendations must be submitted within 3 years of the action. All 7 soldiers had performed their heroic acts more than 50 years earlier. The normal process wouldn't work. Congress would need to pass special legislation. Some members objected. They argued that changing the rules decades later set a dangerous precedent. Others argued that the original process had been corrupted by racism. The debate revealed how deeply racial tensions still divided America, even 50 years after the war. But in 1997, Congress made its choice. The question was whether that choice would come in time for anyone who'd known the 7 men to see them honored. On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton held a ceremony at the White House. 7 African American soldiers would finally receive the Medal of Honor for actions in World War II. The delay had been 52 years. 6 of the 7 men were dead. Their widows and children would accept the medals on their behalf. Only one recipient was still alive, First Lieutenant Vernon Baker, who'd fought in Italy with the 92nd Division. He was 77 years old. He'd waited his entire adult life for recognition. Arlene Fox was 74 when she traveled to Washington. Her daughter Sandra came with her. They'd lived without John for longer than they'd lived with him. Sandra had been 2 years old when her father died. She had no memories of him. Everything she knew came from photographs and her mother's stories. Now she would watch her mother receive the nation's highest military honor on behalf of a man she'd never really known. The ceremony would validate what Arlene had always believed, that her husband had died a hero, but it wouldn't bring him back. The citation was read aloud. It described Fox's actions on December 26, 1944, how he'd stayed behind when other forces withdrew, how he'd directed artillery fire as Germans surrounded his position, how he'd called the final barrage on himself. The citation ended with his last words. "Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell." President Clinton presented the medal to Arlene. She held it in both hands. Photographers captured the moment. The image would appear in newspapers across America. An elderly black woman receiving a medal her husband should have gotten half a century earlier. Vernon Baker stood nearby. He was the only one of the 7 who could speak about what it meant. He'd earned his Medal of Honor on April 5, 1945, leading an attack near Viareggio, Italy. He'd destroyed 3 machine gun positions, 2 observer posts, and 4 dugouts. He'd drawn fire to allow wounded men to be evacuated. He'd done everything the Army asked. Then, the Army had given him a Distinguished Service Cross and forgotten about him. For 52 years, he'd worked civilian jobs, raised a family, and wondered why his service hadn't been enough. Now he knew. It had never been about his service. It had been about his skin color. The 7 medals represented more than individual acts of heroism. They represented 1,000 acts that had gone unrecognized. They represented every black soldier who'd fought in a segregated army, who died for a country that denied them basic rights, who'd come home to Jim Crow laws and racial violence. The ceremony acknowledged that America had failed these men twice, once by segregating them, and again by denying them recognition. Clinton's words tried to address that failure, but words couldn't change the past. The question remained, what would America do differently going forward? The ceremony ended. The families left the White House. Arlene Fox returned to Massachusetts with her daughter and the medal. She placed it with John's other military decorations. The Distinguished Service Cross he'd received in 1982, his Purple Heart, his unit citations. She'd outlived him by 52 years and counting. The medal was beautiful, but she would have preferred to have her husband back. The war had taken him. The Army had forgotten him. And now, 5 decades too late, America remembered. But there was one more question the ceremony couldn't answer. A question that had haunted Fox's final moments in that second-floor room in Colonia. Why had Fox stayed? That question lingered after the ceremony, after the speeches, after the recognition. The easy answer was duty. Officers were trained to sacrifice for their men. Forward observers accepted dangerous assignments. The military culture emphasized selflessness. But duty alone didn't explain Fox's choice. He'd grown up in a country that told him he wasn't equal. He'd attended a segregated university. He'd served in a segregated army. The men retreating from Colonia wouldn't have invited him to their homes. Some probably didn't want him in their army. Yet Fox had died to save them. The 92nd Division's experience in Italy revealed the complexity. The division had been reactivated in October 1942 after being disbanded following World War I. The Army didn't want it. Senior commanders argued that black soldiers couldn't fight effectively. They pointed to flawed studies claiming racial inferiority. The studies were pseudoscience, but they influenced policy. When the 92nd deployed to Italy, they received inadequate training, poor equipment, and skeptical commanders. Some white officers in the division believed their men would fail. Those beliefs became self-fulfilling prophecies. The division's combat record was mixed. They fought well in some engagements. They struggled in others. Critics blamed the soldiers, but investigations after the war revealed the real problems: inadequate training, poor leadership, supply shortages, the same issues that plagued other units. The difference was that when white units struggled, commanders blamed circumstances. When black units struggled, commanders blamed race. The 92nd Division fought under that burden. Every mistake confirmed prejudices. Every success was dismissed as an exception. Fox understood this reality. He'd lived it his entire life. In Ohio, he'd seen separate schools, separate neighborhoods, separate opportunities. In the Army, he'd seen separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate expectations. The system was designed to prove black inferiority. But Fox had graduated from college with an engineering degree. He'd mastered artillery mathematics. He'd volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in combat. He'd proven himself repeatedly. It hadn't mattered. The system still treated him as less than. That made his final decision more remarkable. He could have withdrawn with the other forces. No one would have blamed him. His orders were to retreat. He chose to stay. He chose to die for men who benefited from a system that oppressed him. The cynical interpretation was that he'd internalized oppression, that he'd bought into the idea that he needed to prove himself. The more complex interpretation was that Fox understood something deeper. The men retreating weren't abstractions. They were individuals, with families, with hopes, with futures. They hadn't created segregation, they'd been born into it, just as he had. Fox made a choice that transcended the immediate injustice. He chose to value human life regardless of how those humans had treated him. It was the kind of moral clarity that comes at great cost, the kind that requires seeing past your own pain to recognize shared humanity. On December 26, 1944, in a second-floor room in Colonia, John Fox demonstrated that clarity. His last words weren't about race. They weren't about justice. They were about math. More Germans than Americans. The artillery could save the Americans. That was enough. But understanding why Fox made that choice requires understanding what happened in the minutes before he called that final fire mission. minutes when he knew exactly what was coming. The German voices in the street grew louder. Fox could hear boots on cobblestones, officers shouting orders in German, the sound of rifle bolts being worked. They were organizing for the final assault. His second-floor position gave him a clear view of their movements. He counted at least 50 soldiers in the immediate area. More were arriving from other parts of the village. They knew American forces were gone. They were searching for stragglers. Fox's building was an obvious target, the only structure in this sector still potentially occupied. His radio operator crouched beside him. The man's name was never recorded in official reports. He was one of the 8 Italian partisans who'd refused to leave. They'd fought alongside the Americans for weeks. They knew the German forces would execute them if captured. Staying with Fox was a death sentence. They stayed anyway. The radio crackled. Fox's battalion commander was trying to raise him, asking for a status update, asking if he could still withdraw. Fox keyed the microphone. He reported his situation. Surrounded. Germans massing for assault. Escape impossible. The commander suggested Fox destroy the radio and surrender. Fox didn't respond to that suggestion. Instead, he gave new coordinates. The commander read them back. There was a pause. Then the commander's voice came back. Fox, check your math. Those coordinates are on your position. Fox confirmed. The math was correct. The commander protested. The artillery barrage would kill everyone in the target area. Fox knew. He repeated the coordinates. He could hear the Germans preparing ladders to reach the second floor. He estimated he had 5 minutes, maybe less. The 598th Field Artillery Battalion had multiple gun batteries positioned several miles behind American lines. Each battery had 6 howitzers. Fox's fire mission would involve at least 3 batteries firing simultaneously, 18 howitzers. A mix of 155mm and 105mm guns. The 155mm shells weighed 95 pounds and could kill anything within 50 meters of impact. The 105mm shells were smaller, but still lethal within 30 meters. Fox had calculated the blast radius. He knew exactly what would happen when those shells landed. There would be no survivors in the target zone. Not German, not Italian, not American. The commander asked Fox to confirm one final time. Fox's response entered military history. Fire it! There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell. The radio operator transmitted the message. Then he set the radio down. The 8 Italians with Fox took positions at the windows. They weren't going to hide. If they had 5 minutes left, they'd spend them fighting. Fox picked up his carbine. He'd been an artillery officer, not infantry, but every soldier in combat learned to shoot. The Germans were at the building entrance now. He could hear them breaking down the door. The first German soldiers entered the ground floor. Gunfire erupted. The Italians were shooting through gaps in the floorboards. Buying seconds. Fox listened for the sound he knew was coming. The whistle of incoming artillery shells. The sound that meant the 598th had fired his mission. The sound that meant he had approximately 30 seconds left to live. The Germans were on the stairs now, climbing toward the second floor. Fox raised his carbine. He'd die fighting. That much he could control. What he couldn't control was whether his death would mean anything, whether the artillery would arrive in time, whether the men he'd saved would remember, whether America would care. The first shells landed at 8:23 a.m. The sound was distinctive, a rising whistle that ended in thunder. The building shook. Windows shattered. The concussion wave knocked Fox off his feet. He'd called artillery strikes dozens of times. He'd never been at the impact point. The noise was beyond anything he'd imagined. The second salvo landed 5 seconds later, then the third. The 598th Field Artillery Battalion was firing for effect. All guns, maximum rate. The howitzers could fire 4 rounds per minute when crews worked at combat speed. 18 guns meant 72 shells per minute hitting a target area roughly 200 meters across. The building Fox occupied took a direct hit from a 155mm shell. The round penetrated the roof and detonated inside. Fox died instantly. So did the 8 Italian partisans with him. The explosion collapsed part of the second floor. On the street below, German soldiers were caught in the open. Artillery doctrine called for a mix of airburst and ground impact fusing. The airbursts showered shrapnel over a wide area. The ground impacts cratered the street and destroyed buildings. German soldiers dove for cover. There was no cover. The barrage continued for 3 minutes, 180 seconds, more than 200 shells. When the firing stopped, the street was unrecognizable. Buildings had collapsed. Craters marked impact points. Bodies lay everywhere. The German assault had been shattered. Officers attempted to reorganize their men, but the momentum was broken. The surprise was gone. American artillery had demonstrated it could reach any point in the village. The German commanders made a tactical decision. They consolidated their positions. They wouldn't advance further. Not yet. Not until they understood the American artillery capabilities. That delay was what Fox had bought. The retreating American forces used those hours to establish defensive positions 3 miles south of Samokolonia. They dug in. They registered artillery targets. When the Germans finally advanced again, they met organized resistance. The American line held. The German offensive in the Serchio Valley had failed, not because of superior numbers or better equipment, but because one artillery observer had been willing to die to buy time. The Germans held Samokolonia for 6 days. Then American and Brazilian forces counterattacked. The battle lasted 2 days. On January 1st, 1945, Allied forces retook the village. What they found was devastation. The artillery barrage Fox had called had destroyed several buildings. German artillery and the subsequent battle had destroyed more. The village was rubble. Recovery teams searched for bodies. They found Fox on January 2nd. His body was on the 2nd floor of a partially collapsed building. The explosion had killed him instantly. Around him were the bodies of the 8 Italian partisans who'd stayed. The radio was nearby, damaged but recognizable. German bodies filled the street below, soldiers killed by the artillery barrage. The recovery team counted them. Approximately 100 dead. Fox's last fire mission had achieved its objective. The accuracy had been perfect. The timing had been precise. He'd called fire on himself and killed 100 enemy soldiers in the process. The army transported Fox's body to a military cemetery. They processed the paperwork. They notified his wife. They filed reports. And then they moved on. The war in Italy continued. The 92nd Division fought in other battles. Officers wrote commendations for various soldiers. Fox's name appeared in one, the recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, that would vanish for 37 years. But there was something else in those files, something that wouldn't be discovered until researchers examined them decades later. Evidence that Fox's sacrifice had been even greater than anyone realized. The evidence appeared in German after-action reports captured by Allied forces. German commanders filed detailed accounts of engagements. The report from Samokolonia mentioned the artillery barrage on December 26th. It confirmed approximately 100 casualties in a 3-minute period. But it also mentioned something else. The barrage had disrupted a planned attack on the main American defensive line. The Germans had massed 3 companies for that assault. The artillery strike on Samokolonia had forced them to divert resources to evacuate wounded and reorganize. The main attack was delayed by 6 hours. By then, American defenses were prepared. The German offensive failed. Fox's sacrifice had saved more than the soldiers retreating from Samokolonia. It had saved an entire defensive sector, potentially thousands of lives. The German report estimated the American artillery demonstrated unprecedented accuracy and coordination. They didn't know the accuracy came from one man who'd stayed behind, who'd calculated coordinates while German soldiers climbed the stairs, who'd transmitted those coordinates knowing exactly what they meant. The German commanders concluded that American artillery capabilities exceeded their intelligence estimates. They adjusted their tactics accordingly. They became more cautious, more defensive. That caution rippled through the Italian campaign. The 92nd Division fought at the Gothic Line in February 1945. German forces were more hesitant to attack American positions. Artillery observers like Fox had demonstrated they could call fire even in desperate situations. The Germans couldn't know which positions had observers willing to die, so they treated all positions as potentially lethal. The psychological impact lasted months. Fox had been one man with a radio, but his final decision had changed how an entire army fought. Arlene Fox lived until 2008. She was 85 years old. She'd outlived her husband by 63 years. Sandra Fox became an educator. She taught students about her father's sacrifice. She gave interviews about the segregated army, about the delayed recognition, about what it meant to grow up without a father. The Medal of Honor didn't erase that loss, but it acknowledged what he'd done. In 1997, when Arlene received the medal, she said something reporters remembered. "We never needed any medals. John just felt we were as good as anybody else, and he was going to prove it." And he did. That statement captured something essential. Fox hadn't died to win a medal. He died because the math demanded it. More Germans than Americans. Artillery could save the Americans. The decision was tactical. But the willingness to make that decision, to value other lives above his own, despite how those others had treated him, that was moral. It was the kind of clarity that transcends circumstances, the kind that defines character. If John Fox's story moved you, please hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell stories like this every week, stories the history books missed. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, wherever you are. Our community stretches across the world. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location and if any of your family served in World War II. Thank you for watching. First Lieutenant John Fox deserves to be remembered. These men and women gave everything. You're helping make sure their stories survive.